feel very honored to be the first speaker after the keynote speaker, but I think that has everything to do with my name. It starts with a B, which is quite early in the alphabetical order. By the way, I'm also one of those local guys, so I'm linked with Vlerick Business School. And again, first of all, also excuses to Holger, who is my discussant, for sending my content and my slides a little bit late, but I hope you will hear even more about this. What I would like to say here, well, the topic Tom asked me to deal with is executive compensation and short-termism. And when he asked me the question, I said to myself, well, that's quite an interesting one, because also at the side of practitioners, I also frequently hear the problem and the point that executive compensation might have something to do with short-termism. So I'm going to come back on that. How I decided to approach this topic is by taking a look at research by ourselves. So within Vlerick Business School, we have the Executive Remuneration Research Center, where we collect data for Stoxx 600 CEOs, so throughout Europe. So we have quite some data on there. So I was able to take a look at that one. But I also wanted to supplement it by 6 other papers, which have been published already in the past. So to bring you some sort of synthesis. And I already heard the word incentives, stock options in the introduction by the keynote speaker. So I will come back on these topics. But maybe a first thought from my perspective is, and I found it interesting, are top executives by nature long-term oriented or not? It's a question. I have to say I'm more and more, I would not say convinced, but at least thinking that executive compensation might lead to quite a number of problems rather than always being the solution, which is strange to hear from somebody who is building his career on doing studies in the field of remuneration. But we see a lot of things over there, and I'm going to come back on that one. So, of course, first question is, short-termism. How to take a look at it? Well, I took a look at how the CFA Institute, Chartered Financial Accountants, Analysts defines it, and I think we don't have to focus too much on that one. So an excessive focus on the short term versus the long term. So that's it, leading to an increasing focus on short term earnings, forgetting maybe to some extent about sustainability, human capital, effectively managing environmental and social risks, and so on. So the point I want to make and what I want to talk to you is, to what extent might executive compensation have an impact on that one? Also, what has an impact on executive compensation in this field? So, question, does executive remuneration imply short-termism? I can already give you the answer at the beginning. Yes, there is something in the air over here. Yeah, and I'm going to delve and analyze this deeper by the means of, I would say, 7 studies. Now, first of all, taking a look at the theoretical perspective, I would say, well, we can take a 3-paradigm approach towards executive compensation. You see optimal, and you might know it, of course, optimal contracting, rent extraction, and then institutional theory. And in optimal contracting, in fact, we say, well, it's fine, because what executive compensation needs to do is align the interests of the shareholders with the interests of the top executives, okay? On top of that, the objective is also to retain top executives who are doing a good job. So in and by itself, I would say, well, that holds a long-term perspective. So it's not about short-termism, it's really about the long term. And we see a number of possibilities there provided by executive remuneration, being a pay for performance, transparency on executive compensation, risk sharing, and so on. So that means that executive compensation can be used to perfectly align the interests in the long term. So let's call that the dream. I'm not saying the daydream, the dream, or the objective to attain. At the right-hand side, we have what we call institutional theory, saying, well, but there's also a market out there. And I have the feeling, and I will come back on that one, that sometimes ideas by proxies and practices which are living in the market are very difficult to change. I will provide you with some data out of our own research that shows that the market might be wrong. And I know this is a very dangerous explanation, but I will provide you with some data on that one. But there is the market out there, which we also need to take into account. We have the regulatory context, we have disclosure guidelines, we have the proxies out there. And of course, we also have peer groups and consultants. That's what boards also look at. And then last but not least, what we call rent extraction. So what might happen there is that, well, those top executives might capture the board. If the CEO or the top executives are quite powerful, and I'm going to come back on that, how they can be or become powerful, well, that the board is being captured and that the executives maximize their own rents. And that is, of course, what we do not want, because that is where we have the problem of short-termism. Now, even if I ask this to a business audience and I provide them with the three, let's call it paradigms, and I ask them to what extent are each of these three prevalent, the answer I always get is it's about optimal contracting and it's about institutional theory. They always tell me, well, the use of CEO power, well, it's way less the case. I will come back on that one because that might be wrong. Yeah. So that's my objective. So I'm going to take a look at that element of short-termism in executive theory. Then, of course, the question is, yeah, how to structure this whole story. And I decided to say, okay, but let's maybe structure it around, because the central topic here is executive remuneration. Well, the executive remuneration level being how much do we pay our top executives, being the executive remuneration structure, meaning how do we pay them, long-term incentives, short-term incentives, different sorts of long-term incentives, stock options, performance shares, restricted stock units, and so on and so forth. And then the remuneration criteria, meaning the underlying KPIs, meaning for what do we pay them for? So these are, in fact, the three topics. You will see the different icons. You will see them coming back on the slides in order to make it easier for you to follow. So let's start with the remuneration level. So do we see maybe any short-termism in the remuneration level? Well, in this field, I found two studies. Of course, there are a lot of studies, but within this time frame, I want to focus on some studies I found highly relevant. Well, there's a study on the link between CEO and board dynamics. So this study took a look at to what extent does the central question, CEO power, have an impact on CEO remuneration? Question, of course, is CEO power a good or a bad thing? Well, we could say vis-a-vis the board, it might not always be a good thing. What this study has looked at is to what extent the CEO tenure, how long the CEO is being a CEO, has an impact on the power the CEO has, and to what extent that has an impact on her or his remuneration. What this study has found is quite straightforward. Well, apparently, the longer the CEO is at the helm of the company, the more power he or she has, and the higher the remuneration. So that's something which was found, but that's not the only thing. There's also a decrease in the percentage of independent directors, and also the CEO is less likely to be replaced in case of poor firm performance. So what we learn from this is we have to watch out for CEO tenure, because CEO tenure makes CEOs more powerful, which also increases their remuneration. Very important to say is that this study, of course, controls for firm performance. Yeah? And for that reason, you might say, well, this to some extent might be a bit problematic. Of course, the question is a high CEO remuneration, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because you might also say maybe high CEO remuneration levels will increase the long-term orientation of the firm. Well, I can already tell you there that the answer is not yes, not no. We did, from our own studies, we did not find a significant. But there's one study, and this is a very interesting one, which took a look at CSR performance, so performance in the field of sustainability. And now I might say something quite dangerous, because what is the link between sustainability performance and short-termism? Well, we might assume that if a firm has a better sustainability performance, then it's better also for the long term. So that is something we take for granted here. What is very interesting about this study is that it makes a difference between internal overcompensation and external overcompensation. External overcompensation being the CEO's salary relative to what the market pays, taking into account sector, firm size, and so on. And the internal overcompensation is the ratio between what the CEO earns compared with, not the average employee, but compared with the other people, for example, in the executive committee. So compared with the other highest earners in the company. Now, very interesting is that apparently internal overcompensation has a negative relationship with sustainability performance. By the way, we also see that internal overcompensation also has a negative impact on the collaboration within the top management team. So that is really something we need to follow up closely. But also interestingly is the external overcompensation. Well, apparently that has a positive relationship with sustainability performance. And of course, we could say, well, that's a strange one. And apparently this study says that, well, it might be linked to the CEO's reputation, because if the CEO has a high compensation, he or she will say, well, I really have to define my reputation, so I also have to take a look at the sustainability performance of the firm. So here, external overcompensation is related to the reputation externally in the market, whereas internal overcompensation, well, there you see again that element of short-termism. So if there is an internal overcompensation, apparently the CEO becomes overly confident because he or she says, well, I must be a very good person. Take a look at how much I earn more than my colleagues, and then also maybe over prioritize short-term goals. Yeah. So I think these are already two interesting findings from the perspective of CEO remuneration levels. If we then take a look at the CEO remuneration structure, one study which takes a look at the impact of the CEO's career horizon on the real options. Very interesting and elaborate literature also on the real options. And in real options, in fact, we take a look at to what extent there is a portfolio of different strategic investments, which have, I would not say an impact in the short term, but which have a sequential impact rather than saying there is one large long-term investment. So it's very important also for the long term to keep open a number of real options. And interestingly, here is being said that we should also take into account the career horizon of the CEO, because it might be the case, and I think that's normal, if the career horizon is short, if he or she is close to retirement, for example, well, there might be more short-termism in play. And what this study has found, and this is, I would not say one of the few studies that has where executive pay has a positive impact, but there are also quite some negative ones if you look at CEO power. But here you see that long-term incentives play a positive role. So it's advisable to say if the CEO has a short-term career horizon, which is related to a number of factors, which can be just age-related and so on, there's nothing wrong about that. But there they say, well, long-term incentives play a positive role in keeping the long-term and the long-term options open. Then moving to a study by our own Executive Remuneration Research Center, what we did take a look at here is the impact and the relationship between, based on panel data analysis over 7 years for Stocks Europe 600 firms, we took a look at the relationship between the structure of CEO pay and the long-term financial performance of the company. So we did not just take a look at 1 year after, we took a look at a couple of years after later on. So this is about more, let's call it long-term financial performance. And what we did find there is that we have to pay attention with a large proportion of incentives. So we took a look at the proportion of short-term incentives and long-term incentives together, their proportion vis-a-vis base pay. And there we have found that CEOs in companies where the incentive proportion is more than 3 times what base pay is, well, there we have found a negative relationship with long-term financial performance. The interesting point is that if we took a look at the short-term financial performance, the result was totally different. So we found that if you really want to make CEOs focus on short-term financial results, the best way is to have a high proportion of incentives strongly driven by profit. The interesting point here is that the effect totally turns around in the long term. So that is what we have found here. Also, and this sounds a bit counterintuitive, there is a negative relationship between long-term financial performance and the proportion of long-term incentives, which seems a bit weird because we say, well, it's long-term incentives, but I think we have also already frequently seen that long-term incentives do not always put the focus on the long term. If we take a look at the ESG performance, so based on Refinitiv data, so relationship with ESG performance, the former was long-term financial performance. what we have found over here is that, well, again, the proportion of LTI is negatively related to ESG performance. So having a large proportion of LTI, in this case, companies with proportion LTI between 100 and 180% had a worse ESG performance compared with the other ones. Also, we have found that apparently there is a positive relationship with the use of performance shares combined with a longer vesting period. So, and I think that that feels intuitive. So it's not just about having LTI or not, it's also about their proportion, and it's also about their design. I know which makes it quite complex. Then the last part, which we have been dealing with. So what is the relationship with the remuneration criteria? In other words, what is the relationship with the underlying KPIs in short and long-term incentives? A couple of studies over here. This is an interesting one because this study clearly shows that you need to take into account, so in order to determine on the mix between short and long-term incentives, you need to take into account how far the CEO is in his or her career. In other words, if the CEO has just become a CEO, well, he or she has the short-term incentive and also the long-term incentive. But the long-term incentives are building up over the career because you have shares in your portfolio, you have to keep them and so on. And what you see here is that at the bonus delta, which is at the low end, well, it's the sensitivity of the bonus related to a change in earnings. And that one stays the same over the CEO's tenure. Why? Because the short-term incentive starts again and again year after year. However, if you take a look at the equity delta, which is the triangles, there you see that, of course, the sensitivity of the stock portfolio of the CEO to a change in stock price increases over time. Why? Because she or he has more shares in the portfolio, which means that later in the career, in order to drive investment decisions, in order to drive actions and so on, the CEO will much more take a look at what the impact will be on the share price rather than the bonus and the KPIs driving the bonus having an impact on his or her. Unfortunately enough, we do not see any practice in business that really takes this picture into account. Another study, an interesting one, is, well, it's about the impact on firm performance, which is the financial firm performance. And this study took a look at what they called rigging, which is maybe a nice new word here. It's being about arranging dishonestly for the result of something. So what this study took a look at is to what extent do CEOs use their power to make use of the most positive KPIs for them to drive their incentives. And apparently that was found to be the case. So CEO power being measured, for example, by the percentage of insiders in the board of directors, and also the percentage of board members appointed later than the CEO, which provides the CEO more with more power. So apparently what happens here is that CEOs tend to have an impact on the KPIs which are being used. And for this reason, this study says, well, it's a very good idea to have really a greater ex-ante disclosure on the KPIs that are used in incentive contracts, which is, by the way, what is being done now also in corporate governance regulations. This is also a very interesting study because this one takes a look at what happens just before and just after the vesting of long-term incentives. So assume that we have a 3-year vesting period, we take a look at underlying KPIs, and here you see that you clearly have more firms and CEOs that just meet their goals rather than who do not just meet their goals. And this cannot be per accident. So it's not that the board is doing that perfectly in setting the targets. Well, what you see here, and this was also shown in the study, that this has an impact on R&D investments, cost expenses, and so on, which are not for the good of the company in the long term. What they also say and recommend is to avoid earnings per share as a measure. And that's, by the way, what I see in a lot of studies. Last study from our own study, again, is impact on long-term financial performance. What we do see is that well, pay attention with return-based KPIs like return on equity, EBIT, EBITDA, and so on, as drivers for long-term incentives. What we also see is pay attention with using total shareholder return. And that's what I see in a lot of studies. And apparently it's interesting because the accounting measures apparently have a positive relationship with the long-term performance. And in ESG, again, we see pay attention with total shareholder return measures underlying long-term incentives, which is what we see, which is in a lot of cases the practice in companies. So to conclude, and this is my last slide, I would say, well, let's take a look at CEO characteristics, board characteristics, and executive remuneration policies. We have to pay attention to CEO tenure because CEO tenure leads to more CEO power, which is not always in the interest of the long term, also the long term in the CEO pay. Also, of course, take a look at the career horizon, but there we see that long-term incentives can really help us out if the career horizon becomes shorter. Board characteristics, what we have seen in a lot of studies is the CEO power is really related to the vulnerability of the board. So we really have to pay attention to that one. Insiders in the board and having many board members appointed after the CEO might also lead to more short-termism in CEO pay. And then last but not least, internal overcompensation. So the CEO relative to the other members of the executive committee, if that proportion is very high, well, that might lead to short-termism. And we also have seen, and that's, I would say, a common denominator in the studies we do, is watch out with incentive proportion. I would say incentives work, but they can work too well, which means that in the end, they work badly in the interest of the long-term performance of the firm. So LTI makes sense, STI makes sense, but if their proportion becomes very large, combined with underlying KPIs such as earnings per share and total shareholder return, then apparently it becomes quite dangerous, both from the long-term financial performance of the firm, but also the sustainability performance of the firm. So there seems to be some convergence over there. So that was my overview of 7 studies in 20 minutes or 23 minutes. So that is 2 to 3 minutes per study. So I hope you were able to digest it a little bit. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for the guests for coming, for Tom for inviting me, and for Xavier for the presentation. As Xavier said, he sent me slides, not a paper, and my discussion, therefore, I figured I should take a step down and not have slides. So, and I'll react to what Xavier was telling us, and so you'll have to listen to me and not look at any slides unless I switch them on again. So I will, I think, make 2 points, and then if I have time left, I'll talk about some of the individual studies. 2 points, just generally situating the papers that Xavier discussed in a broader literature. And then second point, conceptually, what are we talking about when we're talking about executive compensation and short-termism? And then thirdly, as I said, maybe some comments on individual papers. Okay, so executive compensation is I wouldn't even say cottage industry. It is an industry. The literature on it, there is, I haven't counted, but I'm sure that there's hundreds of papers per year. And even those that are not explicitly about short-termism, you can read them as being a part about short-termism, because as I'll point out in just a bit, anytime anything goes wrong with executive compensation, it's sort of something that's like short-termism. You can read it like that. So in addition to the papers that Xavier had on his slides, I took another look. I reread the survey by Edmonds et al. In the Handbook of Corporate Governance 5 years ago about executive compensation, and they also cover short-termism as part of that. And some of the themes that Xavier put on the slides, put on the table, reappear there. I will just report the bottom line of Edmonds et al. Is a little bit more favorable towards stock-based compensation and long-term compensation in general. So it's almost the opposite of Xavier's bottom line. They are skeptical about accounting-based measures because accounting numbers can be manipulated in a way that stock-based numbers cannot, at least not in the long term. In the short run, obviously they can be, but in the long run, when you have holding periods, it's harder to do so, but it is a big literature. Many findings are conflicting, and that's another point I want to make about the literature. Especially for those of you who are not academics, the academics know how the sausage is made, but the non-academics may not know. There are lots of academics who want to publish papers, and they all plow the same data sets until they find a correlation that they like, and they write a story around it. And hopefully, and that's the way that science works. I'm not just blaming the finance and business types, the same in oncology and everywhere. Hopefully, if something is interesting enough, it'll be replicated. People will look at it with some different data sets, and over time, some sort of consensus forms about how things really work. But that just means that it is unfortunately often very difficult to learn something from individual papers because, well, we need to be careful in how we interpret those. One thing I might point out in this regard, and I mean Zacharias might have some additional things to say about that. One of the studies that you discussed uses Refinitiv data, and I'm not an expert in sustainability data, but I know from Zacharias that Refinitiv data in particular have been changed over time so that you get different results, which obviously is not good for a data set that's supposed to be historic. And generally, people have found that different sustainability data sets give you completely different results when you look at them. So I'm not saying that sustainability is not an important thing, but I'm just saying that studying it is tricky, and we need to be careful how we read those studies. Okay, so that was just generally like situating Xavier's talk in the literature. Second point, conceptual, about executive compensation, the kind of issues that it inevitably brings. Executive compensation, besides paying the manager for their time, which obviously you have to do if you want them to work for you, is part of a monitoring scheme. It's part of trying to get the executive to do the kind of things that the boss, whoever that may be, shareholders at large in a publicly traded company, or a controlling stockholder in a private company, or maybe the government, even in a government-owned company. You want to get the manager to do what you want them to do. Well, how do you do that? One thing is you dangle the stick of firing them over their head. The other thing you do is you put carrots in front of them to make them to go after the carrot, and then hopefully they'll do the right thing. Like any monitoring scheme, this will lead to some inefficiencies on the margin. And that's not to say that you should abandon the incentive scheme. It's just to say that that's inevitable. So we will always find it. It's a little bit like, do doctors cause scars? They absolutely do, all the time. And sometimes maybe too many scars, and maybe this is partly related to compensation contracts and how they get insurance money and so on. But it is, at least in the present state of medical knowledge, inevitable that doctors cause scars. We hope little of them, but they will cause scars, and all we can do is optimize to get them to not cause more scars than necessary. So same with executive compensation. Does it cause short-termism? Definitely. We only can minimize this. So let me choose another example here. Schooling. We have exams and schools and in universities. Does that cause short-termism, both on behalf of the teachers and of the students? Absolutely, it does. Is it better not to have any exams? I don't think so. There are some schooling forms for certain age groups that don't have exams. But overall, our society has thought that we should have it. Politics. Definitely, politics has short-termism, big time. Is it better to have, I don't know, a dictatorship where short-termism, at least in the ideal type, wouldn't be a problem? I don't think so. Anyway, so I think I've made the point sufficiently clear. So with executive compensation, let's not talk about a publicly owned firm. Let's talk about privately owned firms, controlling shareholder. And at some point in their life, they don't want to run the firm anymore day-to-day basis. So they want to withdraw. So they hire a professional manager. And well, of course, they will choose them wisely. And maybe initially they have a good way of looking over their shoulder because they understand the firm very, very well. But eventually, the more that the controlling shareholder withdraws from the day-to-day management of the firm, the more the controlling shareholder doesn't quite know whether the actions taken by the manager are the right thing to do. And let's just forget about money for the time being. stuff happens. Some other employees quit. There are losses in some business lines, some market share declines, whatever it is. Will the controlling shareholder fire the manager? At some point, probably yes. Is the controlling shareholder behaving in a short-termist way? Quite possibly, in the sense that if the controlling shareholder had been running the firm at the time, exactly the same things might have happened. But in that scenario, the controlling shareholder would have known that this is the inevitable consequence of what the controlling shareholder believes to be the best strategy of the firm. Now, no longer being the running of the firm, no longer understanding the strategy as well, it's mistaken as a signal of bad decisions and therefore the need to replace the manager. Might the manager behave in short-termist ways because the manager understands that that will be the consequence? Absolutely. The manager might, for example, treat certain employees better in the sense of being nicer to them, paying them more money, because the manager thinks that if they fire, I don't know, Joe, then Joe is good buddies with the controlling shareholder, and the controlling shareholder will be upset and won't believe the manager that Joe, in fact, is incompetent, is just sapping money out of the company and running his division in a very bad way. You should fire Joe, but you don't, because it will generate a signal that will get you yourself fired. And I could go on, but you can imagine easily lots of things that the manager might do just to not give the signals to the controlling shareholder that the controlling shareholder erroneously would interpret as signals of bad management. I haven't even mentioned money. It's just a monitoring scheme. It's just inevitable. Now, if you bring in money, you will obviously have things like this happening as well. Just to talk about one more example where I think the conflict becomes really apparent and the difficulty of doing it perfectly. You cannot do it perfectly. I'm not going to give you a mathematical proof now, but you can't do it perfectly. Imagine you want to pay a manager, you want to avoid these short-termist actions. You don't want the manager to do something that looks good now. The manager knows it's bad, but does it anyway, just to avoid the hit of being fired or of not getting the bonus now or whatever it is. What do you do instead? Well, you tell the manager, we won't pay you now, we'll pay you with stuff 5 years down the road. Practically speaking, for public companies, you give them stock. For private companies, you might give them a payout in the future. Okay, so you give them stock, you promise them a payout. What does this mean? One thing, the good thing is, now the manager's fate depends on what happens 5 years out, so that will prevent short-termist action. The bad thing is it exposes the manager to all the risk that comes with having to wait for a payout 5 years hence, when the company might be bankrupt, whatever, could all happen, right? So what is the manager's incentive now when it comes to doing to having the firm sold to an acquirer? The incentive is to have somebody acquire the firm basically as soon as you retire, because at that moment either you'll get a cash payout, which isn't subject to risk, or at least you'll get diversification from having merged with the larger acquirer. So, conceptual point, I just want to hammer this down. There's always going to be short-termism anytime you have any monitoring scheme, be it financial or not, and so that we see indications of that in the studies that we do is important, of course, for us to try to fine-tune executive compensation to avoid certain pitfalls. But we'll always find it, and the only question is how much and where exactly. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay. Xavier, you want to react first or gather some more questions?
Should I be there, or where should I be? Should I sit there?
Yeah.
Well, maybe very briefly. First of all, thank you very much. Very, very interesting, and I think right number of also critical observations. Maybe on the element of shareholder value. What we have seen in our study, in fact, is that, and that's maybe a questionable practice, having those yearly grants of long-term incentives combined with, for example, a 3-year vesting period based on total shareholder return, that became a bit problematic. Because I completely follow you, and it's proven by studies that in the long run, shareholder value equals long-term performance. But that it's more about the practice, and that's in fact my second point. And there are more and more studies in this field, which is related to pay complexity. So what we do see is that due to a very strong belief is that we have to use executive compensation in order to fight all the problems we might have with short-termism, that it becomes extremely complex. If you take a look at what proxies ask us, it's really a lot, and there is maybe too much of a belief in the fact that executive compensation can solve it all, making it extremely complex. And then CEOs telling me, do you really think that that has an impact on me? I do it for the job, I do it for the autonomy, I do it for the challenge, and I will see what will happen. But that's a little bit what we see in there.
Any questions?
Thank you. Do you know any study which looks at the relation between CEO pay, full package, and board membership? Whether or not the CEO is a member of the board or not.
So you mean to what extent that has an impact on
Yeah.
short-termism?
And that members are paid more than member CEOs are paid more, or vice versa.
I'm not sure about board membership per se, but having people on the board, yes, that is positively correlated with, and I usually includes the CEO themselves, but I mean, just speaking about the US scene of public companies, which is by far the most widely studied universe, there the CEO is virtually always on the board, so you wouldn't get any variation to study of a CEO being on the board or not being on the board in that setting.
Is there a trend for not to have CEOs on the board last 9 years or so?
No, I mean, just I really don't see it.
But what you do see, and that might seem logical, is that if board members are relatively higher paid, then the CEO is also relatively higher paid. So that there is a correlation in there. But I completely follow you. We in most cases, we also have the CEO on the board, except, for example, where you have a specific system, like in the Netherlands, where you have the supervisory board, where the CEO is not part of it, and then the management board.
But that's a sort of a difficulty, though, of empirical studies. So you get the full package. You can't disentangle this individual question from the full package.
Kim?
Do you see any room for regulation in terms of caps on CEO pay or other types of tweaks that could help or hinder a short-termism problem?
In any case, I know a paper, I think it was by Ken Murphy, and it's already quite a long time ago, that was saying pay attention with that, because there's a lot of creativity. I think we have seen that also in the US with the raise of stock options and so on. I see there's a lot of reluctance from the side of companies. On the other hand, I think that we see quite some deconnection between business practice and what research tells us on CEO pay and long-termism rather than short-termism. And the question is, to what extent does the government have to intervene? What we do see in any case that, well, if then the proxies would be some regulatory power or force, there you see that it becomes overly complex. So, but that's more of a personal opinion. I'm a little bit reluctant. I'm a stronger believer in a strong board compared with a lot of regulations, because it also depends on the specific situation of the firm with the shareholders and so on and so forth.
So, I mean, it's true that in the United States, I think the history of trying to clamp down on CEO pay is the history of it actually getting bigger, just in different ways. Which is not to say that it couldn't be done. I mean, maybe those measures were bad, but I'm not sure that the level of the pay has a direct connection to the short-termism. And I could immediately imagine stories of how it might actually be very harmful. So if, let's say, you limited CEO pay to 10 million in a publicly traded firm, well, there are private equity owned firms. There are private firms. They can pay a lot more. So if you're a public company CEO, what's the price for you to win? The price for you to win is to become the CEO of one of those. How do you do that? Probably by looking really good in the company you're running now. Could you behave short term for that reason? Now you're no longer trying to impress your own board. You're trying to impress somebody on the outside who understands even less about what's happening at your company. So there you can do really short-termist things. I'm not saying that this is happening. I'm just not saying that. I'm not sure that this would help us with short-termism.
I think Marco and Zach, and then we have to wrap up.
So one long short-termism problem that people have emphasized is, of course, 2050, Mark mentioned it, net zero goals. That's in 2050. CEOs are either dead by then or they will no longer be in the job, but we need them to act now. People have said we should put into pay packages, you should put emissions explicitly into pay packages. There's a big dispute over this. Some people think it's a very good idea. Other people think it's just a form of executives enriching themselves again because they all meet these goals because they write them themselves. Do you have an opinion on this?
Oh, you're the speaker. I mean,
Okay. Yes, I have. What we do see at this moment in time that there is no direct relationship between having ESG measures and the ESG performance. Of course, you need to take a look at, so we need to use what we can use as data. And I think that is related to the fact if I take a look in the remuneration reports, then you see a number of firms where you see that there is really a well-embedded and well-thought of sustainability strategy where really clear targets, ambitious targets are set. And where companies, for example, also say, well, this is where we achieved very well, this is where we underachieved, and so on. Relative to companies that, for example, just then set one metric, and where you could ask yourself, to what extent is this the result of, maybe let's call it to some extent, a power play, because we have done interviews with supervisory board members on setting ESG measures, and they told us, well, what happens is that the CEOs and they come to us with the targets, and they do not always feel well equipped to challenge that. So they say we need more sort of in-depth knowledge. And I have seen a paper recently where it was proven that having a sustainability committee at the board of directors was having an impact on the link between those measures and the ESG performance. So for me, that is to a large extent related to having the knowledge in the board to question it and having the ambition at the level of the company.
Okay, Zach?
Just three quick observations on the complexity. So first, I think one of the reasons why we see so much complexity has to do with there being a huge industry, consulting industry that makes a lot of money from telling companies that they're unique and that everything has to be customized to the specifics of the company. And second, the whole discussion about ESG makes this even more problematic because now also companies, partially because of pressure from shareholders, not necessarily because they think it matters, just because they think they have to do it, are incorporating all kinds of ESG metrics. And we're going to see lots of problems. And I studied one company where there was all of a sudden a CO2 emission target in there. And surprise, surprise, the company met it next year, not that it using emission, but using company money to buy offsets. And so we have to be very careful because it's going to increase complexity and we're going to have this problem of meeting the target but missing the point. And so I'm very much in favor of keeping it simple. Having a base salary, having some equity-based pay with a proper horizon incentive in there through vesting, but not all these 100 other components. But there's industry with lots of money, and so it's going to be hard to change it.
And there again, I follow what Holger was saying. Also, there will always be inefficiencies because some people say what we can use is have a base pay and then give them stock we have to keep for a long period of time, 10 years or maybe more, and that is what is going to add value. And I see some companies that do that. That might also cause some inefficiency. So I completely follow you that there's not something like the ultimate executive reward scheme that does not exist. I would hope from the side of consultants that they also take a look in the mirror and that they really try to do their best coming with the best system. And that again, for me, is related to the board being able to challenge them. Let me give you one example on peer comparisons. So I know a lot of boards that do not spend enough time on asking themselves, who is a relative peer group for me? It's more about reputation than relevance. And that is something which is dangerous. So I would plead therefore for having the right people in the board. And I think it's very exceptional. I've never heard that a board member became a board member thanks to his or her knowledge about remuneration. This almost never happens. So maybe one way or another, we should also do that, making them more critical. And on the ESG question, I got phone calls from a lot of board chairs asking me, well, can you help me with with good ESG measures? And I tell them, yes, I can provide you a list of 500. And it depends on what the situation and the ambition is of your company. And I have seen a study, I think it was by PwC and Tom Gosling, London Business School lately, where they show that, well, there is apparently an overachievement on the ESG targets. And of course, that means that we set the wrong targets or that we use the wrong KPIs. But for me, this is the beginning of a great adventure. We are just at the very beginning, and you really have to learn day after day in that field.
Okay, I think we have to wrap up the discussion here. Thank you very much for the question.